This is Steve Zeltzer with Workweek, and the recent Olympics have been proclaimed as a great financial success and big time profit winner for Peacock and other television stations. The reality behind the Olympics and what went on there is something else in relationship to the working class. And joining us this afternoon is Professor George Wright from Chico State and was a professor at Skyline College and has been active as in the struggle and also in looking at the class nature of sports from the football, NFL to the Olympics. Welcome to our show, George.
Thanks, Steve. Good seeing you too.
So, George, why don't you talk about this recent Olympics? What happened there and what was left out by the corporate media?
There's a lot of ways of going about discussing this. And I think one of the key themes that's missed quite often is the structural nature of the Olympic movement. And that, in fact, what the Olympics are is a for-profit propelling industry or commodity for a lot of different interests. Now, what's kind of interesting is this is a relatively new phenomena related to the International Olympic movement, because from its inception in the late 19th century, led by Baron Pierre de Coubertin, up until the 1970s, the Olympic movement was basically an elite bourgeois for a non-profit effort to actually promote sport. But in the 1970s, the Olympic movement came to a halt because of the various structural crises of the 70s. The overall structural economic crisis, the rise of stagflation, and the so-called fiscal crisis of the cities, to where cities around the world could no longer afford to bid for the Olympic Games because of the various the deficit problems that they faced. So in 1978, when the bidding for the 1984 Olympics took place, the only city that put a bid out was Los Angeles. But that bid was specific in the sense that Los Angeles itself was also trapped in these fiscal problems as well. And so the organizers of the Los Angeles Games told the International Olympic Committee that they were going to pursue a privatized model to run the Olympics. Rather than using solely public funds, which had been used over the years, it was now going to use private sources of money to fund the Olympics. And there were basically three areas of sources for money. One was to begin using corporate sponsorship, meaning to get monies from corporations and allow the corporations to use the Olympic logos and paraphernalia for its own purposes. The second was to use television money. Up until the 70s, the International Olympic Committee was not earning or making very much money. I think in 1972, they earned, I think, about $150,000 selling broadcast rights. But the Los Angeles organizers began selling the broadcast rights to U.S. networks. And to make a long story short, as recently as 2011, the NBC paid the International Olympic Committee $4.38 billion to broadcast 3 Olympic Games. In 2013, the NBC paid the International Olympic Committee $7.75 billion to broadcast the 2022 Winter Olympics. The 2022 Winter Olympics, the Paris Olympic Games, the Los Angeles Olympic Games in 2028, and the Winter Olympic Games, I think, are going to be in 2026. So by the early 90s and certainly into the 2000s, the International Olympic Committee was earning upwards of $7 to $8 billion over a 4-year cycle. So a tremendous amount of money was also being earned by the IOC. Now, part of that money was distributed to the host country or the host city to organize their Olympic Games, and it was also spread out to various international sporting federations around the world. But certainly significant profits were made for the elites that ran the International Olympic Committee. To bring it up to the Paris Olympic Games, that NBC allegedly, this is trade papers figures that I've seen just today, is that apparently NBC earned, I think, $1.25 billion in profits broadcasting these Olympic Games. One of the sidebars to this that I think is very, very important is that if anyone followed these Olympic Games on NBC, and I must say that one part of the Peacock broadcasts for the track and field, I thought was actually excellent, because they had basically no commercials and showed every event that was going on.
But how much did that cost?
They probably, I think it was $1.4 billion was given to the International Olympic Committee just to broadcast the Paris Olympic Games. Okay.
And how much did it cost a consumer, you as an individual, to look at it?
Well, there's several levels to what the consumer is involved in. One, you have to buy your big screen television set, which I did do. Mr. Best Buy earned some profits there. Secondly, you watch all the commercials, and the consumer is supposed to go out and buy the various products being advertised. So that's basically how NBC makes their money back. The advertisers pay NBC for the commercials, and NBC earns money that way. So NBC pays the International Olympic Committee, broadcasts the Olympics, sells the commercials to various companies, and therefore that's how they make their profits and all.
And if you want to watch it just without the commercials, how much does it cost?
Well, I subscribe to Xfinity, Comcast, and then for an additional $2 or $3 a month, you get Peacock, for example. So it's not a significant outlay out of one's pocket to get either the cable service specifically or the streaming service, which is what I relied on while watching the games. But the key is for the consumer watching to buy the various products that are being advertised. There's a second part of this that's very important, is if one watched the broadcast, you saw a significant number of celebrities that were involved in the NBC broadcast. Probably one that stood out quite prominently was Snoop Dogg, who apparently will have a new NBC television show starting in September. But what the audience didn't know watching the broadcast, for those who are inspired by Snoop Dogg's rap music, which I, by the way, have never heard, what is very interesting, NBC paid Snoop Dogg $500,000 a day to be on their broadcast, meaning he was a celebrity that was being paid to market to a particular consumer niche and also to promote his particular broadcast. Apparently, over $50 million was spent by NBC for various celebrities to be marketed.
So this wasn't going to the sports. It wasn't going to the athletes. In fact, I understand that American athletes, one of the things they were happy about is they got free health care in France. which
Right,
they
right.
can't get in the
Yeah,
United States. They don't have
yeah.
health care for many of the athletes.
But keep in mind what all of this is about. The games are being used as a marketing tool for NBC to profit from corporations that are buying commercial time, as well as advertising programs that are going to be on NBC, which will also have commercials that they can sell to advertisers as well. So it's a propelling industry is what it's about. Now, related to the athletes, there were several in track and field, which is the only sport I really watched because of my major interest in the sport. There were several athletes that were very prominent in the pre-Olympic advertising, during the Olympic competition, and immediately afterwards. And probably the most prominent one was the sprinter Noah Lyles from the United States, who won both the 100 meters and the 200 meters last year in the Budapest World Athletics Championships. Lyles was actually paid by NBC for this promotion. And in fact, there were two documentaries about Lyles on the Peacock Sports streaming service. And I've been told, I can't verify this, but I've been told that Lyles was given paid, I think, about $1 million for these to make these documentaries. What was very important is in using Lyles as an advertising tool to market the sport. It was expected that Lyles was going to win the 100 meters, the 200 meters, as well as run on both relay teams. Now, for anybody watching the Olympics, we see that Lyles won the 100 meters by only 5 thousandths of a second. But in the 200 meters, he ran in the 200 meters and got third, which obviously he wasn't supposed to do. But immediately after running the 200 meters, he collapsed, and it was acknowledged that he had COVID. And so what you can extract from that is that the teams around him, his supporters, his coaches, etc., his family members, as well as I'm going to propose NBC, even knowing that he had COVID, wanted him to run because of the marketing role that he played in all of this. Okay. Now, what has come out and what was kind of obvious as this was unfolding, running in this race with COVID, he was contagious and could have possibly infected his competitors. So that's, and I'm going to say a claim. One could argue that possibly could be considered a criminal act. But this is an extreme case of the marketing of using athletes to market for corporate gain and all of this.
And this capitalism, which you say dominates the Olympics and the organization of the Olympics, profiteering, it was also, they excluded the Russian team from the Olympics, but apparently the Israelis who are committing genocide were not excluded.
Right, right.
Is that a double standard?
Well, you could consider it a double standard. Yeah, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there. In the broad sense of things that I think most of your listeners understand is there is a U.S.-inspired NATO war against Russia, and the battleground was up until a week or so ago just solely Ukraine, but now it seems to be reaching into Russia. And for anyone watching this, that any escalation of this could lead to a global conflagration and possibly a nuclear war. But we're not going to talk about this at this point. I think underscoring all of this is that, from my observation as a student of U.S. foreign policy, there's been a demonization of Putin and Russia since about 2004. And I think underscoring this is a project of regime change in Russia. Now, to do this, one has to demonize not only Vladimir Putin, but we see a project of demonizing Russia, which also means the isolation of Russia from international institutions. And so the International Olympic Committee, which argues that it is non-political or apolitical, and that it is not concerned with internal politics or geopolitics, has played a role in the isolation of Russia over the last 10 years. Now, there's a long history here related to allegations about the Russian state using drug policies, state-sponsored drug policies for its athletes, et cetera. I've studied all of this, and there's a lot of holes in the Western argument on this point. And when you contrast it to certainly some American athletes who use various performance-enhancing drugs and perhaps get passes from international sports federations, there's a great deal of hypocrisy there. But nevertheless, the overall project has been the isolation of Russia from the Olympics, which I believe is part of a much broader strategy of marginalizing Russia, leading to regime change through NATO enlargement and the Ukrainian project. It's saying that is that when the Soviet Union, when Russia intervened into Ukraine in February of 2022, I think it was February 24th, immediately the International Olympic Committee suspended Russia from the International Olympic Committee and began to encourage other international sporting federations to also suspend Russia from their various federations, which by definition defined that Russia was not going to be allowed to participate in the Paris Olympic Games. So now, obviously, there were reactions to this in some quarters, but the IOC made a strong argument from various vantage points that the Russians had violated something called the Olympic truce, and that they had annexed territories in Ukraine that undermined the authority of the Ukrainian Olympic Committee, et cetera, et cetera. A strong series of arguments in support of the IOC's decision. On the other side of the coin, the Israeli plausible genocide, I think it's clearly a genocidal project, started on October 8th. That was part of a longer history that most of your listeners understand. And what we've seen is the Western countries have been enablers of that genocide, US, the NATO countries, certainly Germany, England, and France. And so coming into the organization and planning and the starting of the Paris Olympic Games, there have been a number of different forces that have demanded, or at least requested, that Israel also be suspended from the Paris Olympic Games. These included Arab nations' Olympic committees, Palestinian sports organizations, some French parliamentarians have called for the suspension of Israel from the games as well. But the obvious response from the International Olympic Committee, from the French government, from other international sports federations, and certainly from the US government, is that Israel had a right to participate in the Olympics for a variety of reasons. The actual mayor of Paris, Ms. Hidalgo, who was prominent in both the opening and closing ceremonies of the Olympic Games, said, this is her quote, she said, Israel will not be banned from the Olympic Games because it is a democracy, quote unquote. Now, whatever she means by that, I'm not sure, but however she defines a democracy, I don't know. But certainly Israel is not going to be banned from the Olympics. Now, this leads to another set of questions, and that is, what was the presence of Israel in the games. Apparently, some 80 Israeli athletes attended. And there was an enormous amount of security for the Israeli athletes, including members of the Shin Bet intelligence operative who were armed in the games. Also, the French government made it illegal to carry out any demonstrations in support of the Palestinians or against genocide throughout the country, and specifically in Paris at the Olympic competitions itself. So there is a significant double standard in this whole system.
And the double standard of the Olympics, of course, is not new. The Olympics have been political. What happened in '68 and the relationship of the Olympics then till today?
Well, what I would argue is, in a broad sense, is that the key contradiction from the inception of the International Olympic movement back in the 1890s was that it claimed to be universal and non-political, and only individuals were going to participate in the games. But the structure of the Olympics has been national in a variety of different ways. And so there's an embedded contradiction when you have athletes representing nations, their flags are being presented at competitions, their national anthems are being played if they win the gold medal. They can only make the Olympic team based on national processes, et cetera. You have a real problem. Now, because of that, the Olympic Games have not only been integral to politics, they've been a magnet for politics. And so any particular issue, any particular historical moment, the geopolitical events, et cetera, are going to be reflected in the respective Olympic Games. Now, perhaps the most obvious and most blatant was the 1936 Nazi Olympic Games, but we've also seen the games being canceled during various wars. 1916 was canceled, 1940, 1944 was canceled. The pandemic saw the canceling of the postponement of the Tokyo Olympic Games by 1 year. But also we've seen various demonstrations, political demonstrations at the games as well. And Tommy Smith and John Carlos, for example, raising their fists in a anti-racist demonstration was an example. The Black September wing of the PLO trying to kidnap Israeli athletes and coaches in 1972, leading to some 11 Israelis being killed in that episode, is another example. We've also seen a series of boycotts. In 1976, Africans boycotted the Olympics. The U.S. boycotted the Moscow Olympic Games in '80 under the allegation that Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. The Soviet Union boycotted in '84 in L.A. So the Olympic Games cannot escape politics, whether it's domestic politics, whether it's geopolitical politics, or whether it's various groups, regardless of what political persuasion, try to use the Olympic Games to articulate their concerns. This is amplified by the fact that television now broadcasts the Olympics to where some 3 billion people or more are able to watch the games as well. I would like to you have another question, Steve?
I have a question. I mean, what's your vision of a working class Olympics? I mean, you say now, and I agree with you, that the Olympics is not only a nationalist operation in the way it operates, particularly with Western imperialism, Western countries, but also it is not a working class game, but it's orientated towards profiteering and towards using the athletes for corporate profits of the capitalists. What is the vision for a real Olympics that was not bound by profiteering and capitalism? How would that look like, and has that ever been tried?
Actually, it has been tried. In 1936 in Barcelona, there was a People's Olympic Games that was being presented and organized by communist parties around the world. But tragically, it was not able to implement itself. I mean, it literally, people were there in Barcelona, and the day it was supposed to start, or at least the day or two around the start, the Spanish Civil War started, and so these games were never took place. Okay, and so in some ways it's a model that we look up to, but we have no idea how the model would have worked. I don't know if I am smart enough to come up with a working class Olympics, in the sense that the edifice of nationalism, the edifice of money and monopoly capitalism, of imperialism, is so gigantic that I'm not sure how we can kind of weed through all of that and have a People's Olympics. I think one way of looking at that is, I was inspired by an article that was written in Sports Illustrated in 1972 by a writer by the name of Bill Gilbert. And the article, it was, I think, December 24th, 1972 issue of Sports Illustrated. And the title of Gilbert's article was "Trouble from a Gleaning Times." And what he did is, he was very prescient. 1972 was kind of a precipice from Keynesian social democracy national projects to neoliberalism, globalization, etc., and the increased power of multinational, then transnational corporations. And what he saw was this trajectory of where sport was headed. And so he came up with a formulation of sport, and that there were three levels to this formulation. One was simply play, and that's when people play sport and there's no money involved, there's no politics, there's just basically fun. Okay, now we all have played play, okay, when we were children. Some hopefully still do it when they go out and shoot the ball around the basket or play catch or whatever. And then there is also big sport, and the Olympic Games personify big sport. And what, as I've alluded to earlier, the Olympics at one point was still amateur, even though it was bourgeois and nationalist. But through this transition in the 70s into the 1980s and 90s, it has become enormously big sport. Not only the power of corporations and NBC and others, but also the athletes themselves. I mean, if you look at the U.S. Men's basketball team, the overall earnings of just the players is $4.7 billion over their career. These are individuals that represent industries, cottage industries, rather than simply play. But what Gilbert also came up with is a third level to it, and what he called high sport. And that's brilliance, and that's genius, and that's aesthetic enjoyment. And what he argued is that within play, there can be high sport, but even within the context of big sport, there can be there can be high sport as well. And I would argue that Steph Curry, the great Steph Curry, when he went off in the final Olympic gold medal game against France, was an example of high sport. These multi-millionaires, I think LeBron might even be a billionaire by now, were genuinely, money had nothing to do with what they were doing. It was pure joy. Therefore, it was high sport. So my problem, Steve, about how to find a people's games, I just watch sport until we have a workers' Olympics, which means it'll only come about when we have socialism. That's my view anyway. I watch sport to at least find high sport. So I guess that's my response to your question.
And another issue that has come up is the question of climate, the whole climate situation globally, increase in temperatures. They're saying now that they're not going to be able to have the Olympics in the future, in the summer, in countries like France, and the next one is in Los Angeles. And then you have a situation of snow melting around the world and not even having a Winter Olympics. And I mean, it's like capitalism is destroying the world.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
let's have some more wars so we can increase.
Well, the Beijing Winter Olympics a few years ago, they had to create fake snow to have the Winter Olympics, you know?
So the future of the Olympics is in question because of what capitalism is doing to the world and these wars, which are adding to the temperature rise. What do you see the future of this present Olympics? Because that one argument they were saying, or one suggestion, well, maybe they can have the Summer Olympics in the South.
Yes, right.
Winter.
Well, I'm going to promote some paper I wrote. I had an article published in Socialist Register back in 2015 entitled "The Olympic Ruling Class," and if you kind of weed through the paper, by the way, it was edited by Greg Elbow and the great Leo Panich. But if you kind of weed through my paper, my article, what you see is that the Olympic movement has been like an organism that is adapted to the context and the historical specificity that it's dealing with, and that it always comes up with some kind of managerial solution to the current problems. For example, this issue of why did Paris and Los Angeles get the Olympic Games? They got the Olympic Games because Hamburg, Rome, and Istanbul pulled out of the bidding process because they couldn't afford it. And so, and then they had flipped the coin as to which was going to host it in 24, 28. Paris got 24, LA got 28. But that was unprecedented because the International Olympic Committee only in its history gave one city the Olympics 6 or 7 years down the line. They gave LA the Olympics because they were afraid when the actual bidding process for the 28 Olympics would come up, there'd be no cities that would be wealthy enough to bid for the Olympic Games, okay? So there's this constant adaptive, and one of the things about the Paris Games, the cost of the games have been so outlandish for the local organizers that they changed their mandate. The IOC changed their mandate about 2017, saying that that cities don't have to they don't have to build new stadiums. They can use old stadiums, or they can use temporary stadiums to defray the cost. So Paris is now, I think they spent about $10 billion, which is about half of what other cities have paid recently, because it's cheaper. So maybe that's a lure for cities to bid in the future. But back to your point about climate change, my last sentence in the paper I wrote, in the context of the Olympic movement adapting to these changing forces, I said, short of a world war, the overthrow of capitalism and or environmental collapse, the International Olympic Committee will find managerial ways to survive. And as long as NBC is willing to pay billions of dollars to broadcast it, its long-term economic future will be bright. However, the managerial headaches it will have to cope with in an increasingly turbulent world. So that's kind of how I see it at this point. But that's a metaphor for U.S. imperialism, corporations, et cetera. everything's collapsing, but they're using every means they possibly can to survive. That's my view about these wars in Russia and Eurasia. It's Western capitalism. They want to control those markets and those raw materials, so they're willing to go to the edge to possibility of a world war because they're losing profits or investment opportunities in other areas. So I guess that's how I would respond to that.
And the athletes who you saw at the Olympics, I mean, they did tremendous things. And despite, even mental stress and the stress that they're under, these athletes put everything on the line to participate in the Olympics. What did you see that brought you feeling about the strength of the Olympics, of the athletes, not so much the Olympic system, but the athletes?
Yeah. I had a long conversation yesterday with a friend who actually competed in the 1960, 64, and 68 Olympics. And she was a coach of a former Olympic 100-meter champion. And I have great respect for her understanding of sport. And we were talking about this very, very point because in watching the games, I'm well aware of all kinds of new technologies, et cetera, that track and field athletes can use. I'm not saying they all use them. And performances are improving dramatically because these tracks are faster. They're Adidas and Nike and other companies are producing track shoes that literally spring athletes down the track, et cetera. I mean, it's amazing, and I'm personally having enormous problems coping with people. These new times, people are saying, are equal to the pre-tech levels, and I'm having very strong problems with that. But this woman, I'm not going to mention her name, she said, George, you got to remember these kids are working hard, and they're great athletes, and we have to kind of ignore the apparatus around them and respect their courage, their bravery, and their talent. And there are amazing athletes out there. Sydney McLaughlin, Levrone in the women's intermediate hurdles, Grant Holloway in the men's high hurdles, some of these distance runners. One of the greatest races I've seen. I've been to 5 Olympic Games and 15 World Championships, and I've seen hundreds, thousands of races. One of the greatest races I ever saw in my life was the men's 10,000 meters, the first night of the track and field. And why was it so great? It was the courage and bravery of talented athletes not taking risks and taking risks in trying to perform to their utmost. And there's a certain aesthetic and psychological inspiration and brilliance to it. So yeah, there are a lot of inspiring athletes out there. I just wish they had a workers' Olympics to compete in. There's another level to the the Paris Olympic Games, not only related to the geopolitics that we talked about, related to whether Russia was allowed or not allowed to compete, and the double standard related to Israel's participation. And that is the domestic politics involved as well. For those who have some knowledge about French society, not just the wine and the cheese, but the politics and the social conditions of France, I've probably followed events in France fairly closely over the years. I know I have. And what I can say in general is that not unlike most Western countries, France is facing an enormous set of social, economic, and cultural, and for that matter, ethnic and racial contradictions and crises. But France has a particular difference in the sense of the large Arab and Muslim population in the country as well. I think approximately 8.8% of French society is of Arab background. For obvious reasons, most of these people come from former French colonies in Africa and the Middle East. And there is two sides to this problem. One is under Macron, and for that matter, Sarkozy as well, with the implementation of the kind of third way neoliberalism that is the French government has been carrying out under the framework of austerity. There have been demonstrations, strikes, protests, and the like over the last several years. And on the other side, related to French support for Israel and the duplicity that the French government carries out related to its support of claims of anti-Semitism when people are simply protesting against genocide by Israel, not because these people are anti-Semitic. There's enormous crises in France. It's almost like a powder keg in many ways. And what Macron wanted to do was to kind of use the Olympic Games as a means to create national unity and, as he described it, enthusiasm for French athletes to bring the country together and to use his language, to heal the fractions within the society. So the Olympics were to play a domestic role as well in France to try to minimize these differences. Now, I think in real terms, it's pretty naive, if not stupid, on the part of Macron, and that is that these social conditions are not going away. And so you can't cover them up for more than 2 weeks if you're able to do that. Now, along those lines, there was some 80,000 police and military personnel throughout France to prevent demonstrations and protests throughout the country as well. And it was illegal to have protests against Israel during this particular period. So what I would argue is that on two levels, the Olympics were aimed to kind of distract the population and to create kind of this healing environment. But obviously that can't work just specifically related to Israel and the genocide being carried out. Because, for example, there was in the French Constitution, there's a law that Muslim women cannot wear the hijab in public schools and in athletic competitions. And it was specific to Muslim women athletes that they could not wear the hijab, not only in competition, but even during the opening ceremony. There was actually an athlete by the name of some Kamba Silla, a Muslim athlete, French athlete, who wanted to wear the hijab at the opening ceremony, and she was not allowed to do that. And I didn't know this ahead of time, but when I saw her come out for the 4x400 meter relay, it was kind of odd. She had this strange looking cap on, and apparently they did make a compromise that she couldn't wear the hijab, but she could wear a cap. Also, the massive political and military security, and just the inviting of Netanyahu to the opening ceremony is a statement of divisiveness, et cetera. There's another aspect to how Macron has used the Olympic Games, and that is that he's used it as a cover. Let's see if I can get this straight. He's used this as a cover to carry out negotiations with right-wing politicians in France to circumvent going into any coalition with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who is the head of the so-called left-wing New Popular Front government, which won the majority of seats in the July 7th French elections, parliamentary elections. And so while the media is following the Olympics, Macron is carrying out these political strategies to move the country further to the right. And apparently in mid-August, perhaps in a week or two, he will announce this new coalition that will be a further center-right coalition rather than a potential center-left coalition with Mélenchon. What this means is that Macron, who represents a caretaker government, in fact, will be in a position to further austerity measures, police and military repression domestically against protests, and attack Muslim immigrants, as well as continue escalating and support the NATO war against Russia and support of Israel. So we see the Macron using the Olympic Games as a distraction and as a cover for problems and policies that his government is involved in. So I think that's about what I want to say.
And Macron, of course, even offered to send troops to Ukraine.
Right.
To Ukraine, which is
which is still on the agenda, not only for France, but also for other NATO countries as well. Because personally, I believe that there's going to be escalation. There's not going to be negotiations related to that war. Because I don't think, my view is that the US cannot allow negotiations. Now, that's short of the Russians actually winning it militarily, but who knows if that's even going to happen. And I don't think NATO and the US would allow that to happen. I think the escalation would continue. I hope I'm wrong, but those are my views at this point.
Okay, well, I want to thank you very much for joining us. We've been talking with George Wright. He's a professor emeritus and an expert on the class nature of the Olympics, not only the Olympics, but sports, football, the football game, Super Bowl, and has written about these events. And also, as we've covered, his understanding of other sports struggles, and also even the Japanese Olympics, what happened in that, right, and the corruption involved in that.
And the Fukushima, which is still ongoing. By the way, the World Championships will be held in Tokyo next year, September 13th.